week. I appreciate those who prepared the meals and had a part in that. We appreciate those who invited others to come. I hope you'll continue to do that. And we just appreciate the opportunity to be here with you at the Hammond Church of Christ for this series of gospel lessons. We're dealing with everyday Christianity. Sunday morning we talked about Bible reading. You remember that? We talked about quality living. You remember that? We talked about the money, eternal security versus money last night. And tonight I want to talk about being tested by fire. Before I read this, before we preach it, I'm thinking that there are three passages in the New Testament that have to do with Christianity. Brother Bill read one in 1 Peter 4:16. If any man suffers a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God on this behalf. There are a couple of other passages, Acts 11:26, the first time the disciples were called Christians first in Antioch. And there's the third passage that bothers me. The Apostle Paul said, Agrippa said to the Apostle Paul, almost you persuade me to be a Christian. Now, I thought about that a lot in connection with the lesson tonight. I think that it might have something to do with the lesson tonight. I think that Agrippa had seen that Paul was in bondage. He was in chains. He was in straits as being a Christian. He was in bondage. And I'm thinking that maybe Agrippa said in his heart, I don't want any part of that. I'm more important than that. I'm a king. I don't have time to go into bondage. And I couldn't serve as a Christian. Now, I want you to know that sometimes, though, and he may be right if that be the case, we do have to serve in bondage. We do have to serve in servitude. We do have difficult days. And I want to read this passage, and we're going to preach on about 3 or 4 points tonight, and the lesson will be yours. Daniel chapter 3, verse 27. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said, notice what he said, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angels and delivered his servants, who, here's the servants, put their trust in him, talking about God, violating the king's command, talking about Nebuchadnezzar's, and yielded up their bodies, number 3, so as not to serve or worship any God except their own God. I want to tell you, they've said a mouthful here of what they're willing to do in order to serve God. They won't put their trust in anyone but God. They'll violate the king's command if he orders anything other than what God says. And they will yield up their bodies if necessary. Agrippa was not willing to do that. Most people are not willing to do that. When the rough gets going, the going get rough, or vice versa there. And what we need to realize as Christians, things will not always be peaches and cream. Now, what I want you to do tonight, gather up your children. Keep an eye on them during this service. And think about how your children are being raised. And think about, if you will, what they may have to go through in the future. And think about how you may be able to help them now to overcome the difficulties of having to yield up their own bodies for the cause of the Lord. What I want to do is, with the first point of the lesson there in chapter 3, verse 27, it says, they put their trust in him. And it turns back now to chapter 1. Who are we talking about here? We're talking about the children of Israel who had been brought out of bondage. They had been brought from Judea. The prophets, Jeremiah, Isaiah said, the nation of Judah is going to fall. Remember, Jeremiah got in all kinds of trouble. Thrown in a miry pit. Isaiah got in all kinds of problems. Judah is going to fall. And now we see the fruition of their action, their sermons. Years later, this is what's happening in Daniel chapter 1. And what happened was that Nebuchadnezzar came in, and in 606, this is not in the script, but I'll read it to you. I'll tell you the story, and then we'll read the script. That they came under a Babylonian oppression in 606, and when they did, they took the royals and their children out of the land of Judah into bondage, into captivity. And then 8 years later, they came in and took Ezekiel and Jehoiakim, the king, out of Judea, took them into, and the army, and took them into bondage. And so Babylon was doing real well here. They were taking over, as the prophets had said, Judea, because they're inactive to serve the Lord properly. And then in 2 or 3 years later, they took the common people and just left the poor people in the land. You can imagine living in a land where just poor people. That had to be a sad situation. And of course, for 70 years, the rulers and their children were taken out. The king and his army was taken out into captivity, into Babylonian captivity. And the middle-class people were all taken out, just the poor people and the sick and the afflicted left in Judea. You can't do anything with that group of people. And so what we want to see, though, several things here that allowed these people to put the Lord first, even in affliction. Now let me read it to you, beginning verse 1. Daniel 1, verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it, just like the prophet said he would. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. What a sad story. That's a sad story, that God's house would be robbed. And they'd be taken into a pagan territory, in with a pagan God. Look at verse 3. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of the officials, to bring in some of the sons of Israel, some of the kids, including some of the royal family and of the nobles, youths in whom was no defect, who were good-looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, and who had ability to serve for serving in the king's court. And he ordered them to teach them the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. And he did that so they could go back into the homeland of Judah, their homeland, and infiltrate into the homeland of Judah later the culture of the pagans. Sad story, isn't it? Brainwash kids. So they go back and brainwash the rest of the people in the land of Judah when they did ever go back. And then verse 5, and the king appointed them a daily ration from the king's choice of food and from the wine which he drank, and appointed that they should be educated 3 years, at the end of which they were to enter the king's personal service, make slaves of the kids. Now among them from the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Then the commander of the officials assigned new names to them. And to Daniel he assigned the name Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abednego. Now, I want to suggest to you that there are a number of trials in here, for an adult or for children. Number one, I'll start with the last verse there, verse 7. He changed their names. Been given godly names. Been given names for the people of God, from the people of God, named after the people of God, we'll see in a moment. And he gives them a pagan name. That's an insult, if there are any insults. I don't know what you know about nicknames or not, but my family, we're all nicknamed. And we had a brother that slicked his hair down, didn't like his curly hair, so he'd go around slicking his hair down, looking in the mirror. He got the name Slicky. Then I had one brother, he could walk on his knees. He'd walk all over the place on his knees. He got called Monk. And another brother couldn't say his name correctly, was Frankie. He could only say Frank D, and he got nicknamed D. And another brother wore his cap like one of the guys that drove by on the tractor on the farm hands, named Mason. And see, he wore his hat like Mason, so he's called Mason. And I'm not going to tell you what Donald would be called. But you think you would outgrow those nicknames by the time you're grown? No. D is coming. Slicky will be over here in a minute. And I had a sister, a baby sister, that all she did was walk around wanting somebody to hold her. And so she was called Wag. And I had one sister, older sister, she's always putting on perfume. Her name was Pamela. And I won't tell you what we call her. But my point is, nicknames do stick. And these names were given, I guess, as nicknames, but they also were in derision. How would you like for your children's names to be changed? For an example, Belteshazzar was called Daniel. His name was changed to, or Daniel was changed to Belteshazzar. You know what Belteshazzar meant? You don't want to know. The favorite of Balaam. You take a godly child, 15, 16 years old, these children were. Think about your children when they get 15, 16. Can they handle being tested? Daniel had no other choice, did he? He was called Belteshazzar, a servant of Balaam. What a sad story. If you have a Christian child, 15, 16 years old, you don't want him to be taken over and being called a Muslim. You don't want him being called any other religion, Islam, Mohammed. You don't want him to be called after any other religion. You want him to be called a Christian. But when you're under servitude, that's a different story. And the other boys also had names. Shadrach, his new nickname was Young Friend of the King. That would be a bad thing today. Young Friend of the King. We want your child to be called a Young Friend of the King. That carries all kinds of implications. And Meshach, one who is what God is. Now, that's a pretty good nickname. Abednego, he got Jehovah's Helper. I don't know how he was able to get that, but he was named after God. And that was a good thing. But my question to you tonight is, could your children take that pressure? Could your children, could we take that pressure? It was placed upon us. And someday it may be. And so what I want you to do to hold your children tight tonight and think about what they'll be like when they're 15 or 16. If they were taken into servitude, could they take the pressure? And what are you doing now to help those children to prepare to be what the Lord would have them to be under such oppression? It might be from a mate. They might marry, a boy might marry a girl that just gives him difficulty all day long in being a Christian. It happens all the time. Or your daughter might marry a man that just leads her off into the world. How will your children react under such pressure? And then if you look with me at verse 5, another test were given to them. The king appointed for them daily ration. Now, they weren't used to no daily ration. Jews had the right food, the food given by the law that they were supposed to eat. From the king's choice food, and from the wine which he drank, and he appointed that they should be educated 3 years, at the end of which they were to enter the king's personal service. I don't know whether you remember or not, but these people were not to be drinking wine. You remember in Proverbs chapter 23? Just keep your marker here and look at Proverbs 23. They didn't have the right to violate the law that the God had already given them. And now here's someone trying to force them into changing their diet. And I want you to notice in every case, these boys resisted. Now, are your children such as to be able to resist such temptation? Remember what it said in Proverbs 23:29? Woe has woe. Who has woe? Who has sorrow? Who has contentious? Who has complaining? Who has wounds without cause? Who has redness of eyes? Those who linger long after wine, those who go taste mixed wine. Do not look at the wine when it is red, when it sparkles in the cup, when it goes down smoothly. At the last it bites like a serpent and stings like a viper. Your eyes will see strange things. Hey, the Jewish law already said, don't just eat and drink anything. Remember they had to eat the right kind of meat under the law, Exodus chapter 20. They had to drink the right type of drink. And here they are under pressure. And they are under pressure to give up their bodies in service to the king, and they refused to do so. And if you look at another trial that we find in here, in verse 4, their good looks. You know, it's not always having good looks. Good looks will get you in a lot of trouble sometimes. Verse 4, youths in whom was no defect, who were good-looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, and who had the ability for serving the king's court. And he ordered him to teach them in the literature and language of the Chaldeans. And the reason for that, so he can take over the world. He can send these boys into all the world and take the language of the Chaldeans. He can take the culture of the Babylonians and conquer the world with these young men. Would you want your children to be under such duress? Certainly not. And what are you doing now? If you've got a good-looking daughter, just as pretty as a picture, what are you telling that girl? You need to be warning her. If you have a handsome son, you need to be warning him of the difficulties. You have a mark against you here if you're that handsome. You also may look at their personality. They have the wrong type of personality. You can tell whether they're going to get in trouble or not, whether they're going to go into the world or not, what type of disposition they're going to have, and how they're going to be able to get along with others. We need to begin working on those things right now. If they're 5, 10, or 15, there's a few years in there for parents to be able to protect their children and to get them going in the right direction. And keep your eye on them all the way. Keep your eye on them until they're grown and gone and on their own and living a godly life. Being as a Christian. Don't give up on them. And then, if you look with me to verse 2, the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them into the land of Shinar, in the house of God. And he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. How would you like for the furniture in this building to be taken down to a synagogue? How would you like for this building to turn into a mosque? It'd be a disgrace, wouldn't it? And it was a disgrace for Nebuchadnezzar to take the vessels from the house of God in Jerusalem and put them in with his gods in his land in Babylon. Which that's what happened. And we need to realize things like this can happen, but how well prepared are we to make sure that we take the advantage of the opportunity to serve God effectively? And I know we have to count the cost before we become a Christian. We need to teach our children to count the cost. And we need to realize the difficulties in being and living the Christian life. So to go back to verse 28, Nebuchadnezzar responded and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants, who put their trust in him." They didn't fool these boys. They were not deceived by Nebuchadnezzar. Because, number 2, look at the next phrase. They violated the king's command. That's what we need to teach our children to do. If someone leads us astray, we need to teach our children to violate those charges that are placed upon us. And what we're able to see in connection with that is chapter 3. To deal with the second point of violating the king's commands, chapter 3 says, Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, a height which was 60 cubits, and the width 6 cubits. He set it upon the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent word to assemble the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, and the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of the province to come to the dedication of the image of Nebuchadnezzar the king set up. Okay, now I'm going to be king. I'm going to be God, Nebuchadnezzar says. I'm going to build an image, a tall image, and everybody's going to have to bow down to me. And verse 3 said, then the satraps and the prefects and the governors and the counselors and the treasurers, the judges and magistrates and all the rulers of the provinces were assembled for the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up, and they stood before the image of Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, to you the command is given, O peoples, nations, and men of every language, including, of course, the Judeans, especially the Judean boys that we just talked about. And then in verse 7, therefore at that time when all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, the trigon, the psaltery, and the bagpipe, and all kinds of music, and the peoples, the nations, and the men of every language, fell down and worshiped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. But you look at verse 8. These boys refused. Why? How were they able to do that? Their parents had taught them differently. Gather your children together tonight and teach them differently. Teach those kids and grandkids what they need to know and the fact that they can rebel against authority if necessary in order to serve the one that truly lives. Look at verse 8. For this reason, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and brought charges against the Jewish boys. They responded and said to Nebuchadnezzar the king, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made the decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, the lyre, the flute, the trigon, the psaltery, the bagpipe, and all kinds of music is to fall down and worship the golden image. But whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. There are certain Jews, Mr. King, whom you have appointed over the administration of the province of Babylon, namely Shadrach, friend of Baal, Meshach, friend of the king, Abednego, these men, king, whom have disregarded you, and they have not served your gods or worshipped the golden image which you've set up. What are you going to do about this, king? You've told these boys what to do. You've told everybody what to do, and these boys from Judea refused. 15-year-old boys refused. Then Nebuchadnezzar, enraged and angry, verse 13, gave orders to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then these men were brought before the king. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said to them, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up of me? How dare you not bow down to me? Verse 15, now if you are ready at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, and bagpipe, and all kinds of music to fall down and worship the image that I have made, very well. But if you do not worship, you will immediately be cast in the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. And what God is there who can deliver you out of my hands? Well, they knew what God could. Why? They had already refused orders already. They knew the power of God. Verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter. Mama has taught me the truth. My preacher has taught me the truth. I know the God that I serve. We don't even need to ask. We've already told you this already. We don't even need to tell you the second time. Oh, don't you wish your kids could be like that? They can be. In verse 17, if it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to serve us from the furnace, can deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire. And he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. We don't have any doubt about what's going to happen here. We're not afraid of a burning furnace of fire. Verse 18, but even if he does not. Now, I like this teaching by Mama. Son, even if you have to die for the cause of Christ. 1 Peter 4:16 again, we just read. Even if you have to die for the cause of Christ, that's okay. Don't deny your faith. But even if you does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods. We're not going to bow down to you either, or worship the golden image that you have set up. We're just not going to do it. Now, what are you going to do about it? Oh, that's some faith for some kids to have it. And they didn't. And we can be proud of them for that. That's a trial. We might go back here in a moment and tie it up as to see just what happened to it. But let's look at another trial down in chapter 4, verse 19. Chapter 4, 19. By this time, Daniel was about 60 years of age. He had grown from 15 to 60. Time passed fast in this book. He's going to be an old man. And look at the test he's under again. Then Daniel, who's, verse 19, chapter 4, 19. Then Daniel, whose name is Belteshazzar, friend of Baal, we talked about that. Oh yeah, they had to name that. They had to put that on him. He's not a friend of Jehovah. He's a friend of Baal. They had to put that nickname on him. Was appalled for a while as his thoughts alarmed him. The king responded and said, Belteshazzar, do not let the dream or its interpretation alarm you. And what had happened here is the king had had a dream. And nobody could interpret the dream. And only Daniel was able to do that. Oh, you're talking about someone having the power of God to be able to do that. Daniel did. He could interpret dreams. And he was preparing the king for his kingdom loss. Now, it's easy to tell the king good things about what he wants to hear. That's easy to do. But it's hard to tell a king bad things that he don't want to hear. And he tells him the dream. He had a dream about a tree being cut down, leaves of the trunk left, and nobody could interpret it. And Daniel was able to do so. And what he's able to do here is say, therefore, verse 27, therefore, O king, may my advice be pleasing to you. Break away now from your sins by doing righteousness. Now here he's going to give him some bad news. He said, king, now get your heart right. He's preaching to the king all the time. He's giving him the bad news about to lose his kingdom. He said, now get your heart right. Do righteousness. And from your iniquities by showing mercy to the poor, in case there may be a prolonging of your prosperity. Now, if you do right, king, you're going to live longer. If you don't do right, your kingdom is coming to a close. You're losing your power. You're losing your nation. And then in verse 28, as this happened to Nebuchadnezzar the king, 12 months later, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. He's just about to lose out everything he's got. The king reflected and said, is this not Babylon the Great, which I myself have built as a royal residence by my might and by my power and for my glory and for my majesty? Bow down to me. That's what he said. It's mine, it's mine, it's mine. Bow down to me. Well, the word was in the king's mouth, a voice from heaven saying, King Nebuchadnezzar, to declare, sovereignty has been removed from you. Uh-oh. He wouldn't change his heart. Doomsday has come for him. And you will be driven away from mankind, and your dwelling place will be with the beasts of the field, and you'll be given grass to eat like cattle, and 7 periods of time will pass over you until you recognize that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind and bestows it on whomever he wishes. What a sermon to a lost man about who God is. Immediately the word concerning Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled, and he was driven away from mankind and began eating grass like cattle, and the body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair had grown like eagle's feathers and his nail like bird's claws. But at the end of that period, Nebuchadnezzar raised my eyes toward heaven, and my reason returned to me, and I blessed the Most High and praised and honored him who lives forever. You get that? After he lost his kingdom, he recognized who God was. He did have the power to take away his kingdom. Now, let me just say this before we go any further, and we'll wrap this up in a few minutes. These boys were preachers. These boys set the example. These boys converted even a king. And he went on to say in verse 34 about God, for his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation, and the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing. Well, yeah, you say that now. You've lost your kingdom. You finally woke up. But at least he woke up, and these boys brought it to his attention. That you're a lost man, and you need to acknowledge God, and he did. Goes on to say, but he does according to his will in the hosts of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and no one can ward off his hand or say to him, what have you done? Boy, he hits the nail on who God is. There can't be no one greater than God. I thought I was greater than God, but there is no one greater than God. These boys have proved it. And I could go on all night talking about example in this. If you look down with me to when Daniel was 70 years old. Well, you've come up to your age here now. There's still hope for you. Notice when he's 70 years old. Then they brought the gold vessels, verse 3, 5 and verse 3. Brought the gold vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God, which was in Jerusalem. And the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank the wine and praised the gods, and gold and silver and bronze and iron and wood and stone. Suddenly the fingers of man's hand emerged and began writing opposite the lampstand in the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the back of the hand that did the writing. And the king's face grew pale, and his thoughts alarmed him, and his hip joints went slack. Maybe I'm describing it. And his knees began knocking together. Oh, he was scared to death. A finger writing on the wall and no hand there. And of course, he called all of his wise men, and they didn't have any answer for that. But then Daniel, verse 13, chapter 5, verse 13. Daniel was brought in before the king. The king spoke and said to Daniel, are you that Daniel who is the one exiled from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah? Now I have heard about you that the spirits of the gods is in you, and that illumination, insight, and extraordinary wisdom have been found in you. Just now the wise and the conjurers brought me in before me, that they might read the inscription and make the interpretation known to me, but they could not declare the interpretation of the message. Why was Daniel able to do so? His mama had taught him to respect God, to listen to God, to follow God, Jehovah God, not the God of Baal. That's not the gods of Baal. Prophets couldn't do it. Now let me tell you right now, I can preach this all night, but I'm not going to do it, but I'm telling you right now, there's some lessons here to learn about who God is. Verse 16, but I personally have heard about you that you are able to give interpretation and solve difficult problems. Oh, don't you want your children to be able to do that? Especially religious questions. When the tulip doctrine comes up, total depravity, irresistible grace, unconditional election, once saved, always saved doctrine, when it comes up, can your children refute it? When someone says you're saved without baptism, can your children refute it? You know, there's not a passage in the Bible about baptism that puts it other than after. Salvation comes after one is baptized. There's not a passage that would refute that. And can your children know where baptism comes in the plan of salvation? He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. I believe you can teach them that. And don't tell them, not anybody tell them any different. Don't let anyone tell them any different. This is what you teach, this is what you preach, this is what you believe, this is what you set the example for all the days of your life, young. Verse 17, Daniel answered and said before the king, keep your gifts for yourself. or give your rewards to someone else. However, I will read the inscription to the king and make the interpretation known to him. And he read to him what the handwriting on the wall stood for. How was he able to do that? God gave him the power, gave him the ability. His parents taught him right about who to serve all the days of his life. You may be in the audience tonight and know that you need to be a Christian. You may have heard the gospel preached tonight and you know that you need to make some changes. You may know that you need to correct your life. You say, I'm only 15 years old. Well, you may need to become a Christian even at 15. Or you may be in the audience and say, I have not lived as I ought to live. I have not lived as the Lord had me to live as a Christian. I have not lived like these boys have. I need to make corrections in my life. Do that tonight. Through repentance and prayer, you can come back to the Lord. You can be restored to the Lord. You can lay your head on your pillow tonight and sleep like a baby, knowing you're in the right relationship with the Lord. Or if you're here and been visiting with the congregation and like to identify with the church, you need to consider that as well. The church has open arms for people with open hearts, receptive minds to the truth. And if you're a Christian, you can do that as well. We urge you tonight, whatever your condition is, not right with the Lord, step to the front as we stand and as we sing.
Turn to song number 924. 924, Just As I Am. Just as I am.